You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. On today's episode, as part of the Engage Safety Series, How It Works with Jeremy Maclellan from the Central Air Safety Committee. Here's your host, Ryan Argenta.
Welcome back to another Engage podcast. I'm here with Jeremy Maclellan of the Central Air Safety Committee. This is a series that we'd like to call How It Works. And today we're talking how 30 and 168 works. That's the 30-hour required rest period in the preceding 7 days, how to calculate it, and how it affects regular pilots and reserve pilots differently. Jeremy, welcome back. Kick it off, 30 and 168.
Thanks. I know this is a riveting topic, but we see this come up a lot in ASAP, as well as different avenues such as social media and people reaching out to ALPA to try to understand this. Oftentimes where we see this show up is a pilot thinks they're legal and scheduling says they're not, or vice versa. So overall, the goal here is just to make sure that pilots understand the concept behind having 30 hours of prospective rest in the preceding 168 hours. So that's 7 24-hour periods. And this is before you start a short call assignment or a flight duty period. I'm going to foot stomp the word start probably 8 to 10 times throughout this podcast, because that is one of the most commonly misunderstood parts of 30 and 168. So at the end of the day, FAR 117 requires a couple of different limits that aren't necessarily an FDP limit. This is one of those, and this is a rest requirement. This is to prevent pilots from being on duty 14 consecutive days, let's say, without some opportunity to get some known recuperative rest somewhere in there. As a reminder, similar to shifted report times, similar to FDP limits, this is an FAR legality. It's not a fly now, grieve later situation. So you have to get the 30 and 168 piece figured out before you go on short call or start an FDP. So 30 and 168 oftentimes is confused because people use the term 7 days. They also use the term 168 hours. And then when we get to the end of that 168 hours and you look back for the 30 hours, when did that need to be? When did that happen? Did I have it? Was it prospective? There's lots of things that go into it. So I'm going to hit a couple of definitions real quick, just so we're all starting on the same sheet of music. And then we'll go into the calculation. Does that work for you, Ryan?
Absolutely.
Great. So the first thing is this is a rest requirement. So there's multiple places you can look for what rest means, but sometimes this does confuse the situation. So rest is a continuous period determined prospectively. You had to know about it ahead of time when the rest started. And we'll get to some examples of when that may not be the case. But it's a prospective continuous period for which the crew member is free from all obligations to the company. Basically, you are not at work and not required to be at work. As some people have realized, this 30-hour rest period can happen on a layover.
Gotcha.
That doesn't mean 30 hours at home. It just means 30 hours free from duty. The perspective piece of this, let's say you land tonight at midnight in Charlotte and you had a 29-hour and 30-minute layover. You go to bed, you wake up, you have your day in Charlotte, you go to bed the next night, you wake up the next morning, the flight's delayed 30 minutes and 45 minutes, let's say, and you have a shifted report time. So now you ended up having 30-hour layover. That is not prospective rest. So that would not count for your 30 and 168 calculation. So it does have to be prospective.
Same thing if you land early.
When you start the rest period, if you know you have 30 hours, it counts.
Okay, so if I'm scheduled for that 29.5-hour layover in Charlotte and I'm supposed to land at midnight and I land at 11 a.m. because we had a kick and tailwind, and now I have 30-hour and 30-minute layover and I'm going into my rest period knowing I have 30 hours and 30 minutes.
That is perspective. Yes.
Now, that seems like that can work to my advantage and also to my disadvantage.
That is correct. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation is the perspective definition means when the rest period starts, you know about it. That's why if it starts and you had 29 and it somehow ends up being over 30, that's not perspective. The opposite is unfortunately not the same scenario. once you landed Charlotte and you got in early, 30 hours, that does count for a 30-hour rest period.
Okay, very good.
So the rest piece is something I wanted to foot stomp, as well as the perspective piece, because that's oftentimes where people get confused. The other confusing part of 30 and 168 is what time period are we looking backwards from for the 168 hours? This is the point in the podcast where I ask everybody to take a deep breath, get your mind right, because this gets complicated. If you hear nothing else, the time you use to look backward 168 hours is the start of the FDP or the wrap on the 7th consecutive day of work. It is the start of that day, not the end. So you don't have to be good for the entire day. It's just when the FDP or short call starts on that 7th consecutive day of duty, you have to be able to look back 168 hours and see an entire 30-hour prospectively known rest period.
Okay, so as an example, today's Friday, I'm a line holder and I had a 8 a.m. report. If I'm a short call reserve pilot and my wrap starts at 8 a.m., same time, and I'm on short call for 9 hours or I have a 9-hour duty day, that 9 hours doesn't matter. I start at 8 a.m. and I work backwards 168 hours from that 8 a.m. on Friday.
That is correct. So line holder, it's the start of the FDP. A short call pilot, it's the start of the wrap, and it's only the start of that day.
And the reason they do it in hours is because it's a rolling 168 hour period and it goes to the exact minute, right? So
that is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. And so that is the most commonly misunderstood part of 30 and 168 as to what time you start at to go backwards. Another common misunderstanding is if day 7 in this scenario is a deadhead only duty period, that's not an FDP, and you do not need the 30 and 168 look back for day 7. So oftentimes when pilots, due to delays or due to changes in their schedule, they end up having a 30 and 168 issue. The company can deadhead you on that day and then give you because that's not rest, right? The deadhead's not rest, but they can deadhead you to either home or to another layover and give you that 30 hours then.
Okay. That's terrible, but okay.
It's rough. I totally agree. So a lot of times subtracting 168 hours from 8 a.m. on a certain day is math that even the most sage pilot has a problem doing. So here's a simple way to do this math that I think will help everybody understand better 30 and 168 and how to calculate it. Take your day 1 report time or start of short call, let's say, or even long call, any kind of duty on day 1. Subtract 6 hours from that. I'll stop while everybody processes that. So take your report time on day 1 or your start of duty, subtract 6 hours. So let's say today you had a 10 a.m. report time. You subtract 6 hours, that's 4 a.m. You have to start short call or an FDP by 4 a.m. on day 7 or before that. Again, take your report time or start of duty on day 1, subtract 6 hours, and you have to start your duty on day 7 at or before that time to be legal.
Yeah, you just simplified that completely. This is why you're in this job.
And if you get a piece of paper out and write it out, I promise the math works out, but that is the simplest way to do it.
In that example, you've got to start your duty period before 4 a.m. on that 7th day. And so if you're rerouted or you're trying to white slip or something is going on at 8 a.m. on day 7, you're not legal for that because of a rest issue.
That's correct.
But if it starts at 3 a.m., you're good to go.
You're good to go.
So here's where I find this probably chaps pilots is you want that green slip, but you need that 30 and 168. So this would be a way you're looking in open time. You're going, yeah, come on. I know I can get this. I can squeeze it in. And if it reports at 3 a.m., maybe a bad example, but that's probably why it's a green slip. And so if it starts at 3 a.m., you're good. If it starts at 8 a.m., you're not going to be eligible.
Absolutely. And that, of course, means you never had any more 30-hour rest periods, obviously intervening in that situation. So
Sure.
A lot could happen, but assuming there's no 30-hour layover that you know about prospectively in that time period or something else that would reset that clock, you are correct. Where it gets a little bit, I won't say muddy, but a lot of times people start long call at midnight. And so it is important to keep in mind this subtracting 6 hours from day one to apply to a time period on day 7 works for regular pilots or reserve pilots. You just have to be careful if you're a reserve pilot and your long call started at midnight on day 1, that your last chance to start an FDP or a short call is actually at 6 p.m. on day 6. And again, I won't bore everybody with that math, but because it started at midnight and you got to have the 30 hours prospective rest, that actually works out. It's not day 7, it's day 6 at night because of the way long call works.
Yep, that checks. Okay. That was great. Thank you. What else about 30 and 168? What are we seeing? What are the issues? What are the ASAPs that are coming in? Why is Central Air Safety talking about this?
So we see 30 and 168 issues every week at a minimum in ASAP. And this is mostly because pilots are worried about their legalities. I thought I was legal, so I flew, and now I'm being told I wasn't legal, or some version of that story. They're giving the details so that we can look into it and try to figure out where the confusion comes from. And this is part of the educational piece to try to educate pilots so that we can hopefully make everybody feel more comfortable about their legalities. So here's some things that we've seen. Oftentimes, day 7's a deadhead only duty period, like I mentioned before, and people don't realize that 30 and 168 is not a requirement for a deadhead only duty period on that day 7. Another example would be some of the stuff we talked about with you had a 30-hour layover, but now you were delayed and it's only 29 hours now. So you do not have that 30-hour layover. Sometimes tracking software is not great at doing this math for the pilots.
See, that's surprising to me because my assumption is that those computers are Loctite.
I would be careful making that assumption.
That's okay.
Another example would be if you landed, let's say, in Columbus, Ohio at 10 p.m. and you had a scheduled 14-hour layover. You get up the next day and the flight was canceled. And now, based on when that flight's rescheduled and you're rescheduled, you end up with 32 hours of rest in Columbus. That's not prospective, but people think, oh, I had a 30-hour layover, I'm now legal. It was not prospective rest, so no, you're not. That does not satisfy the 30 and 168 requirement. A couple of other things that come up that we have seen in ASAP is typically when reroutes start happening and you were legal when you started that rotation, you had the 30 hours, but now you've been rerouted into an off day, or you've been rerouted into 30 hours that you would have had off. And now you have another 4 days starting after that, where you're now not at some point in that second rotation, you're not going to have that 30-hour look back. You're not legal to even start that second rotation until it's modified by crew tracking to ensure you have somewhere in there the 30 and the previous 168. So you can't just go start flying that rotation up until the point that you're not going to be legal. That's not how it works.
Okay, that's good to know.
We did see another example just to drive the point home on the IT system, maybe not capturing everything. We had an example where a crew basically got delayed. They got a message on their rotation that said false 30 and 168. So the computer flagged the 30 and 168, but then a human being got involved and said, no, never mind, that's a false 30 and 168. Well, they looked at their schedule and said, I think that's legitimate. So they talked to tracking. Tracking said, nope, you're legal to fly. And then the pilot was like, I'm confident that I'm not legal. And they elevated it to a supervisor who then said, no, the pilot's correct. They are not legal to fly. They put them in 30 hours of rest after deadheading them back to base. And during that 30-hour rest, that pilot got called for an inverse assignment. So the computer was still not properly looking at 30 and 168. So pilots, if you hear nothing else, you're responsible for your legalities. And although the company is putting in efforts to try to fix these gaps in the IT system and where it should be flagging this stuff, we should always make sure we are ensuring our own legalities and not counting purely on the company's software to keep us legal.
That's a great point. Jeremy, we all love war stories, especially when they're not from our own. But here's one that was submitted by a DART, and it's not my story, so with a grain of salt. But can you kind of verify this example? And so a 220 pilot is on a 3-day rotation. They are up against their 30 and 168 rest window, which is going to, in their minds, going to occur on day 4 on their off day at home.
Okay.
And then after their 30-hour rest, they start another 4-day trip. They're on the road. They're on day 3. They get rerouted. It bumps them into that 4th day. Now they're up against that 30 and 168 rest. Scheduling is aware. The computers are correct. It agrees with the pilot math. And crew tracking gives them a deadhead only duty day to San Francisco to a 32-hour layover, then pick up the balance of the 4-day rotation that they were scheduled for on their line. So now you're away from home for 9 days.
I will stay in my lane and speak only to FAR 117 and legalities. There sounds like there could be some multiple PWA issues there, but from a 117 legality perspective, that is legal.
Okay.
Yes, they could deadhead you, which it sounds like that deadhead was not impeding upon the 30 and 168, but they do deadhead to a greater than 30-hour layover. That resets the 30 and 168 clock, and now you're on the road for another 4 or 5 days. And we have seen examples of pilots that have been on the road for 14 days.
That's where you call fatigue.
Yeah, you have to constantly assess your own fitness. And just because the regulation said that you're legal to continue, there's a lot of other circumstances that come into play that we are responsible. So just like I said before, yes, you're responsible to make sure you're legal for 30 and 168, but you're also responsible to certify your own fitness before each flight. And this is a scenario where certainly I would imagine at some point it's time to say uncle, and we've got to get some meaningful restorative rest.
You heard it here. Jeremy Maclellan, Central Air Safety. We talked 30 and 168, way more complex than I thought. Thanks for that. The resources are out there. Use them. Contact Central Air Safety. You've got the ASAP program, company iPad, ALPA folder, fatigue. You can also call 1-800-USA-ALPA, ask questions, and don't fly fatigue, don't fly illegal.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This has been Engaged, the podcast for Delta pilots. Thanks for listening. My name is Ryan Argenta. Stay safe and keep the rubber on the road.
You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform, and receive notifications when a new episode is available.